Spectres, welcome back to the Mass Effect Lorecast. This is your host, Tom, or Robots. I'm here with Sam and some very special guests this week because we are taking on a very popular theory today. I know you've probably heard about the comparisons between Shepard and Jesus, and we have some very qualified individuals who are actually hosts on other shows on the network to come join us and talk about Mass Effect and Shepard Jesus and give us some perspectives on this. So we've got Sam as usual. Sam, how's it going, man? Welcome back to the show.
It's going great. Yeah, this is something that I've wanted to dissect for a long time. And we're not going to endorse it or not endorse it, but we are going to analyze this theory because it's just everywhere across the internet. I can't tell you how many Reddit threads I've seen, how many YouTube videos I've seen. Is Shepard space Jesus? So I figured, you know what, we should look at the points, examine the evidence, and then make a conclusion if we can.
Yeah, it's just like anything. We're not in one camp or another. We're just going to see how well the evidence holds up for one direction or another. And maybe at the end, we'll have different opinions than we did at the beginning, like legitimate consideration of the facts and details and things like that. It's almost a scientific
Arguments
process.
In good faith,
right,
if you will.
Imagine that. Critical thinking at its best. And to join us this week, we have Teecup and Shecup, who host a number of shows on the network. Welcome to the show. I'm going to start with Shecup. Shecup, welcome. I don't want to say, hey, welcome, and then have you both argue about who's going to talk. So Shecup, how are you? Welcome to the show.
Hello. Welcome. Thank you. Glad to be here.
Awesome. And then Teecup's here as well. Teecup, why don't you let people know about your other shows and how they might be aware of who you are?
Yeah, so we are the co-host of the Dragon Age and Assassin's Creed Lorecast. So you can find those obviously on the network and anywhere you find your podcatchers. So we co-host those two podcasts.
Yeah, awesome. And very excited about Dragon Age and the new game coming out and all that. Yeah.
And I'm a co-host on the Holocron Histories podcast.
There you go. Yeah. So lots of lore stuff, lots of other shows with some interesting lore and things like that. But also, you guys aren't just, anybody. You've got some bona fides about this whole Jesus Shepard thing, right? Like what's that all about?
That's fair. I mean, I would say now Austin is more qualified than me, but we both have bachelor's degrees in religion, and we both have MDivs, Master of Divinities, which is a study of religion also. So we're pretty academically prepared for this subject. Like, this is where my life is leading up to this point.
Yeah, all these degrees are so that you can do a podcast about Mass Effect. It has nothing to do with actual Christianity or any real world stuff. But speaking of that, where do we get started? Sam, how do we kick this off? Like, we're going to go over the theory. We're going to take it apart in different details. Where do we start?
Right. So there's a few key points that we can go over, but more or less it's pulling details that players think correlate between Shepard's journey and Jesus' story in the Bible. So let's go through these and we'll talk about whether any of them hold weight and see if it's possible that intentionally or unintentionally the writers made a Jesus-type savior character in Shepard. So first point I wanted to bring up. This is something that a lot of fans who ascribe to this theory, that they bring up that Shepard is dead and then resurrected by the, quote, Lazarus Project. Why might people point to this as being a sign of Shepard's story being so similar to that of Jesus?
I think that one time that we need to keep just in the back of our minds, and we'll talk about this more towards the end of the episode, is that there is a difference between what we consider a literary Christ figure and the person of Jesus of Nazareth. And so a little bit, I think the resurrection is a big deal because Jesus is resurrected. Like, that's his big point that comes in there. And in a literary analysis, from a literary perspective, like if you're looking at someone who is a Christ figure in like literature or something like that, resurrection is not actually something that is a criteria.
Oh, really? I didn't realize.
Yes,
like there's a list of official criterias, and that's just like one of the things that it could be there, but it doesn't have to be.
They can, but they don't have to be.
Right.
And that's a big kind of thing. A good example of when it is not would be, I'm trying to think. can't think of one where there's not one, but like obviously like you have Gandalf, where Gandalf
Sure.
sacrifices himself and then he comes back
Yeah.
later. But like it is the important thing is that point of sacrifice. That is the big point when it comes to a literary Christ figure.
So
and so, like-
sacrifice or willingness to sacrifice in a situation. So,
Correct.
So in the Lord of the Rings, this is a good example because I do the Lord of the Rings Lorecast, and some people have argued that Gandalf is a Christ figure literarily. Some people have argued that Aragorn is a Christ figure literarily, going through the halls of the dead and coming out on the other side as his sort of sacrifice and rebirth sort of kind of thing. Some people have even argued that Frodo is a Christ-like character because he was willing to sacrifice himself. And to your point, he didn't actually. He survives the adventure, at least until the end of the book where he goes off to Valinor, but still serves that role of making a lot of sacrifices himself throughout the story in order for the salvation of everybody else. So yeah, I think that does track. Like all three of those characters can kind of fit in that in a way.
And Shepard sacrifices themselves twice.
Yes. And I think that the two sacrifices actually serve different literary points. I think the sacrifice at the end of 3 and the sacrifice he makes at the beginning of 2 are different. And so here the sacrifices, he sacrifices himself to save Joker / the Normandy crew as they're attacked by the collectors, all of that. And then the important thing with a Christ figure is that sacrifice, if there is a resurrection, that sacrifice has to lead to the resurrection. Take the Harry Potter universe. Harry doesn't come back unless he had taken that sacrifice of willing to die for all of his friends. Sorry, spoilers for
Spoilers.
I don't even know what
20-year-old book series at this point.
20-year book series.
Yeah.
But like Harry, without that sacrifice, Harry doesn't come back and defeat Voldemort. The sacrifice is the important part from a literary perspective. And like from the point of like, he is resurrected by the Lazarus Project. So if you don't know, Lazarus is a story in the Bible. He's one of Jesus's friends. He's the brother to Mary and Martha. You might, if you're familiar with the story, this is a story of like Martha is busy cleaning the house and Mary is sitting listening at Jesus's feet, and Jesus praises Mary and then says like all of that going on. That's the same family. So Lazarus dies. Jesus is late. He comes back and he raises Lazarus from the dead, kind of in the book of John, foreshadowing his own resurrection. But from like in the Christian like theology perspective, the resurrection of Lazarus is different than the resurrection of Jesus because Lazarus dies again. Jesus never dies again. And that's a big point of like in Christian circles, they will say the phrase Christ is risen. It's not Christ has risen. Christ is risen because Christ is still alive.
This is an interesting point. So, sorry, I just wanted to interject from a Mass Effect point of view that the sacrifice then that we would talk about if we were going to compare Jesus to Shepard would be Shepard's dying first to save the crew of the Normandy and Joker specifically. And then Shepard gets spaced, Shepard dies, and then Shepard is resurrected.
Right. But then he dies again at the end of the story.
Right, but then he dies again.
Right.
Unless you picked the perfect canon destroy ending in which Shepard is alive. That's canon. So in that regard, I just wanted to clarify, Teacup, you're saying in that regard, the fact that there is a sacrifice, a death, and then a resurrection, and then possibly a second death or not, it could go either way, whether or not this is a valid point, drawing a parallel between Shepard and being a Christ-like figure.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I think Shelby has some points to add about like some comparisons to like what the role of the resurrection plays in this story.
Yeah, I was going to talk about how I know a lot of times in some Christian denominations, there is a tendency to focus only on the death and not on the resurrection. And for me, I mean, I am a Christian, so I'm taking this from a personal as well as an academic perspective. The resurrection of Jesus is the ultimate point of the story. It is the climax of the story. Yes, Jesus comes back in the biblical narrative. He does have some resurrection, post-resurrection appearances where he talks to talks to the disciples and appears to some of the other followers, but his work is done generally after he is resurrected. Whereas with Shepard's work is just really beginning, I would argue, when Shepard dies and is resurrected.
The first time. The first death.
There's
right.
The first time, yes. There's so much that Shepard has left to do. So I would argue that those are kind of they're two different literary starting points, where with Shepard, the resurrection is almost at the beginning and you have the whole life ahead of you. Whereas with Jesus, the resurrection is at the end and the life on earth has been lived. And I feel like that's a really big difference thematically that we should bring up.
Yeah,
that's
solid point.
Great point. Yeah. And speaking of that, that's Shepard's first sacrifice that we're talking about. But by the end of Mass Effect 3, Shepard has once again sacrificed themselves to save the galaxy, which would make Shepard a savior-like character, right? This is another point that people who like this fan theory of comparing Shepard to Jesus, making Shepard a space Jesus-like figure, they'll point to this and they'll say, well, look, Shepard sacrificed himself to save all of the galaxy, not just the people who were, on board with and liked Shepard, not just Shepard's followers, but everybody.
Yeah, not just humans or something like that. Yeah.
Right, not just humans, as the Elusive Man may have preferred. So how does this line up with Jesus's fate in the Bible, and does it hold up as a comparison?
Well, I think absolutely that holds up as a comparison. There are a lot of Bible verses that talk about, Jesus did not just come to save the Jewish people. Jesus came for Jews and Gentiles. And that's a lot of where the Bible focuses on, like the Jewish versus Gentile, which basically just means the Jewish community and then everybody else, the Romans, the Greeks, the rest of their really diverse world back in the first century. And so we don't quite understand the term Gentile in our culture because it's not a thing. But basically you can understand it as, the Jews and every other culture. And so for me, when you have a person who comes to the world for his own religious community, and then also all of the others, the Romans, the poor people, etc., that's very clear that this is a person who is dedicated to all people, not just his own group.
Yeah, so there's a connection there, I think, for sure. Like he's not selective. He's sacrificing himself for the entire galaxy, and so that would be a very Christ-like thing to do.
I think this one is interesting because I think it is heavily dependent upon what ending you choose. And this comes down to him saving the galaxy from the cycle might be true for synthesis and control, but we have yet to see in lore if he actually does end this cycle in regards to the destroy ending. Like, did organics create AI and synthetics who rose up and destroyed everything?
Right. And this is something that, it basically is like time will tell whether or not the catalyst was full of crap. And because the catalyst tells us at the very end of Mass Effect 3, you can choose destroy, but that's not going to solve the cycle. However, I find this to be paradoxical because the Reapers are the ones enacting the cycle. They're the ones who, we just have to trust their word that if left unchecked, that synthetic development would eclipse organic development and then lead to the extinction of organics, just as the Reapers are doing right now. So, you know what I mean? So it seems like it's paradoxical. They're fulfilling their own prophecy that they themselves implicate or imply is inevitable, but they're the ones it's like going to someone, hitting them in the face, and then saying, well, if I didn't hit you in the face, you'd still get hit in the face. Okay, but I'm still getting hit in the face by you. So I like that we can examine that, Shepard is freeing the galaxy from the cycle, but are they? Because we don't actually know what happens after the fact. And I'd also kind of like to imagine this post Mass Effect 3 memory of Shepard as somewhat apocryphal, right? Because no one else is on the Crucible when this happens. So any story that could possibly come out of this is always going to be secondhand and somewhat lending to a myth.
Right. And BioWare, from a perspective, talking as a co-host of another BioWare game show, they are not above saying, oh, the endings of this game are rumors and not actually canon, because they did that with Origins.
Yeah. Unreliable narrator is a wonderful way to handle multiple endings for games and things like that. We see it across a lot of different series. Yeah.
Right. I think another point of like, because the important thing for the Liturgy is that the sacrifice is what leads to the resurrection. So you could argue that Shepard is only the Christ figure in the Destroy ending, because that is the only ending that results in Shepard living. Not that resurrection. You could argue that Shepard lives in control, but does he?
The same way that Jesus lives after resurrection, right? Not in a corporeal form.
Yes. And so, but the other thing about this is about the reason that I would not say that like consent or synthesis and control are the same freeing of the cycle, the same way that Jesus frees from sin. Because for Christians, at least in their in the theology, it's not that Jesus' sacrifice, like just, Jesus dies on the cross and then automatically we're all freed from sin. I mean, there are Christians who do believe that, but typically it's more of we now have the ability to choose to be freed from sin. And I feel like synthesis and control take away the agency of the rest of the galaxy in a little bit. Control less so than synthesis, but synthesis definitely. And so like this idea of freed from sin, especially with synthesis, is not really that, because like the consent of choosing to follow Jesus, of choosing to live in a life free of sin, is essential for a lot of Christian beliefs, because of the central idea that like Christ and God represent perfect love, and perfect love cannot be non-consensual.
Right. So this is one of the things I want to just throw in here while we're kind of talking through this, is the difficulty and difference between writing a novel or making a movie and making a video game. Because in these kinds of video games especially, the player has the ability to make whatever choices they want. They get to choose the ending. If this was just a novel and the novel ended in a certain way, you could very definitively say, okay, well, this is a Christ figure because this is the only way things can end and play out. So maybe the conversation doesn't need to be so much about, is Shepard always a Christ figure, so much as, is Shepard ever a Christ figure? Is there an ending in which that actually does does the game give you the ability to play Shepard as a Christ figure, even if that's only one ending, even if that's only one scenario? And real quick, to jump in this, because I know we're going to get comments on this. Sam, you mentioned that Jesus doesn't show up in a corporeal form, but there are definitely passages, especially the Doubting Thomas stuff in the New Testament, where he shows the wounds on his hands, he lets people touch him. And that is very specifically put in the Bible in order to fight against some of the conversations that were going around in the ancient world about how Jesus wasn't corporeal on his resurrection. And so those passages would argue against that point, that in fact he was, but he was more than just that. So
it goes back to like, if you're familiar at all with Christian, you probably heard things about the doctrine of the Trinity. Well, one thing that is essential to the Trinity is that Jesus is both fully human and fully divine.
Right.
Which, just let your brain sit with that. And if it makes your brain hurt, it's supposed to.
fully divine, fully human. A Trinity, a God in three parts. All of it is very confusing when you actually just look at the components and go, wait, how does this all add up?
Well, I'm thinking about this in terms of Shepard, and Shepard was both organic and had a lot of synthetic parts by the end.
Right.
And if we are looking at this from the synthesis point of view, where synthesis is the ultimate evolution of not just humanity but any organic race, then wouldn't that also implicate that Shepard was already kind of one step ahead in that evolutionary process?
Maybe
having those implants.
Maybe
it's interesting.
Yeah. Well, in Mass Effect, we have a little bit of a nod towards spirituality with certain races and their gods and their beliefs and things like that. But it is by and large not a very spiritual series. And I think you could, and this would be a completely separate episode, but you could probably make an argument for the idea of the AI and the ascent of organic life to something beyond organic life as being an analogy to something that could be seen as spiritual in some way. But I don't know that that's a lot harder. Right. It'd be like a techno spirituality thing. Like for example, if you could take your mind and deposit into a non-organic form so that your mind could live forever, you could argue that that's a form of spirituality in the afterlife and that kind of thing. I don't know that we need to go in that direction with this conversation, but I mean, that may lend itself towards some of this Jesus analogy, like you were saying.
Yeah.
Sure.
I just want to.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I just want to add a little bit of from another sci-fi/fantasy. One of the big themes in Star Wars is that as you become more machine, you become less human or person. The famous quote from Obi-Wan about Darth Vader, he's more machine than man.
Right.
And in a lot of sci-fi and literary points that is point to as the world becomes more machine, they become less human. Right. So it is an interesting kind of parallel that Mass Effect does, because it kind of flips that kind of trope on its head.
Right.
Especially with the Geth and the whole does this unit have soul, which does indicate some sort of spirituality, understanding or something.
Sure. And to your point, I would agree with you. I would argue that most sci-fi and fantasy actually has the opposite trope. You mentioned Star Wars, cyberpunk. As you become more machine, you become less human. Even the industry versus nature in The Lord of the Rings, for example. As things become more mechanical and industrialized, they get further and further from the way they're supposed to be. So,
I mean, that has its roots in literary literature much older, right? With Nathaniel Hawthorne, anti-transcendentalism. But we could go on about that forever. I wanted to address something here that I believe Shecup has written in the notes that makes it an important distinction in Shepard's journey versus Jesus's journey, and it's the presence of violence done by the protagonist, right, Shecup?
Yeah. So I know you compared kind of the cycle of Shepard is freeing the galaxy from the Reapers, and then Jesus is freeing humanity from sin. But I feel like that comparison it's very different, because you're right, as you've said, Shepard is literally fighting a war, killing maybe not people. I don't remember. Yes, people.
Sometimes
because
people. Sometimes very bad people.
All of these
yes.
factions, all kinds of stuff, right? But primarily the Reapers is what the war is being fought against. Whereas Jesus never fights a war. That is not a thing that happens in the Bible. And in fact, that's a very important part of Jesus's story, because the Jewish people at the time that Jesus lived thought that the Messiah would be a military leader, and Jesus is not. And so there are all the people at the time that Jesus lived in the first century that thought, oh, well, the actual Messiah is going to be this military leader, is going to be this king. And then Jesus comes and says, I'm the Messiah, and he's someone completely different than what they've expected. And there are times in the biblical narrative where wars, fights, protests, riots could have and probably did break out, but we have evidence in the Bible, at least, of at least one time where the disciples try to fight back against the Romans. When Jesus gets arrested, Simon Peter cuts the ear off of a soldier, and Jesus rebukes Simon Peter and says, no, this is not what I've come to do. And Jesus heals the man. And so there's a lot of people that point to these passages and say, well, Jesus was a pacifist. Jesus would have fought no wars. And I think that's a big, big, big difference between Jesus and Shepard.
The closest Jesus gets, at least in my memory, is the moneylenders. Is getting upset at the moneylenders, tipping their tables over, and basically confronting them in a very physical kind of way. Although he doesn't, we don't read anything about him. He doesn't punch anybody, he doesn't stab anybody, nothing like that.
Right.
Well,
Jesus pulled a renegade interrupt.
Right.
He does actually braid a whip and whip the moneylenders with the whip.
Okay. Yeah.
So
Okay. You're
there
right.
is that.
You're right. Yeah. Yeah, no, good call. I forgot
But he
about
doesn't
that.
kill those people. He
Right.
doesn't like punch them. You're right. But he does get a little violent, and I think that there's the similarities with Shepard here because it's violence against injustice, not violence for violence's sake, not violence just because it's the easy way out. It's okay, we're going to take this course of action because this is what is the most just for the most people.
Right. And not for power either.
You know,
I think that's the big thing is that if he was
Yes.
coming to claim power, then the violence would have been very different than if he was rebuking moneylenders who were misusing the temple. That is not that did not gain Jesus power. That was just him saying, this is offensive, stop. Right? Like it's a very different reasoning for why you're doing it.
Yeah.
So yeah, interesting points. Sam, did you want to say something?
Well, nothing more than I already said about Jesus smashing the renegade interrupt. I don't know how many other perhaps paragon or renegade interrupts Jesus was presented with in Jesus's life. Yeah, but I'd probably say that Jesus much more often hit the paragon interrupts, and I'm being facetious here as to say that I think a lot of the paragon actions that are programmed in Mass Effect are designed to be more of that turn the other cheek, more of that New Testament God that we read about in the Bible. But I also wanted to bring up another point here about ages, right? So Shepard is 29 in Mass Effect 1 and then was killed 1 month after the Battle of the Citadel. That's, 1 month after Sovereign's invasion on the Citadel. Shepard is killed in action 1 month after that. And then Shepard is dead for 2 years and then resurrected. And then we play the events of Mass Effect 2, and then Mass Effect 3 takes place half a year after that. And at one point in Mass Effect 3, Anderson remarks that it's been several months since Shepard left Earth. So if you're keeping up, that means that depending on when Mass Effect 1 started, technically Shepard could have been 33 by the time that Mass Effect 3 ends, right? And if not 33, then 32, almost 33. And if Shepard is 33, that's the same age that Jesus is when he's crucified, yet at 33, Shepard dies while activating the quote-unquote crucible. So you can see the parallels here that some fans are pointing to and saying, see, this is intentional. This is not on accident.
I'm just trying to wrap my head around that I'm the same age as Shepard and Jesus.
Yeah, that's what happens when you get into your 30s.
My age either.
Yeah, I think that's cool. I think it's I mean, we're about to talk about some other things, but I think these little details feel kind of intentional. I mean, you could have picked any age for him to be, and yeah, I mean, sure, he's in his late 20s. He's old enough to be an adult and have been an adult for a while. He's old enough to be a leader that people will trust, those kinds of things. That makes sense. But it just does seem very specific, right?
Yeah, and I think that BioWare, at least in general, has a very well-read writing staff.
Oh, yeah.
In the history of these games. And they might not like set out to say, oh, we're going to make a Jesus comparison, but their writers and everything are so well read enough that this stuff just kind of, bleeds through just through their writing.
Yeah. Or maybe they did. Maybe all it takes is one writer to say, the age should be this. And they don't even have to tell the rest of the writing staff why. But in their head canon, they're going, well, we're making a Christ-like figure in our game. Why not?
All right, so another point that a lot of people who push this theory, they point to is the protagonist's name is Shepard. And they say that this is, a biblical allegory that directly correlates to Jesus. Now, why might they point to the symbology of the protagonist being named Shepard as a biblical connection?
So this reference comes from the book of John. It is one of 7 statements where Jesus says, "I am blank," or whatever. 7 is an important biblical number because it represents God. But these "I am," what they're called the "I am" statements, the word, if you're a biblical thing, you might recall the story of Moses, where Moses asks, "What's your name?" He basically like, what do I tell these people? And God says, "I am who I am," or in Hebrew, probably more literally translated, "I will be that which I will be."
I also like how that reminds me of Popeye. I don't know if you've watched the old Popeye cartoons, but he'll say things like, "I am what I am, and that's all that I am."
Yes. So when Jesus says these, he's equating himself with God.
Right.
Just rolling over, Popeye.
Sorry, Popeye.
Anyway, he equates himself with God in this. So like, "I am the good shepherd" is like, God is the good shepherd. I am God. This is what the thing. And so in John, he says that I'm the good shepherd. I know my sheep and my sheep know me. The things like that.
Right. And there's other analogies of like a flock of sheep and keeping the sheep from the lions and like that kind of that's all throughout
right. And
stuff.
You know, Lamb of God, that
Lamb
kind of
God,
language as well.
Sacrificial lamb, that as well. Yeah. Yeah. So there's a lot of shepherd there. But you guys, do you feel like the spelling is different? Do you think that that's a major thing? Is that worth mentioning, or is it just kind of like, well, they just picked a different spelling? I think you're muted.
All right, while we wait for her, I will interject here because I know some of our listeners are screaming at their radio right now saying, "Shepard is named after Alan Shepard, the astronaut." We know this. This is something that we've covered before, but in terms of, addressing whether or not there was any biblical influence on deciding to name Shepard, then, we're going to continue addressing this. But Shecup, you had something that you wanted to include.
Yes. So I was going to say, I feel like this one is a coincidence. One of my reasons was what you just mentioned, but also I feel like Shepard, Herd, is also a last name. Like if they wanted it to be more of a biblical reference, why would they not just go with the biblical spelling?
It may be the Alan Shepard thing. It may be that they were making that reference also. And so they went with the one that referenced an actual real life person because that would be a little bit less obvious. Or maybe you wouldn't even know to make that connection unless the spelling was the same. But then you could also say, but it's very similar to the word shepherd, which is a biblical reference. Because imagine if you flipped it the other way, you wouldn't assume Alan Shepard. Like that probably wouldn't even be part of the conversation. So they had to go with the Alan Shepard spelling and then be able to apply it in both directions. That would be my guess.
Right.
And I also...
The other thing is, at the very end of Mass Effect 3, there's a scene in which an old man is talking with a child. And the child asks the old man to tell him another story about, quote-unquote, the shepherd. Now, this is like I think of one of 2 or one of 3 times where we hear the shepherd or some variation of that. We also hear it from Kai Lang, where he says that he intends to rewrite the story of Shepard. We also hear, the cult of Shepard. And so it is Shepard being used in multiple ways throughout the series.
Yeah, I think I have 2 points. One is on topic. So the first is that I think also the comparison is the same reason that like the Bible, the Gospels tend to use shepherd. I don't know if you've ever been, or if anyone has been around sheep or anything, but they are dumb. They are really dumb animals.
Breaking news here on the Mass Effect Lorecast. Sheep are dumb.
Like they needed a shepherd because they would just walk off a cliff.
Right.
Like that's why they needed someone, because they would just. So I think the like analogy of like the council, the Citadel species are so blind and so entrenched on their power that they're getting ready to tumble off a cliff.
Yeah.
Well, here's the shepherd that is trying to keep them from tumbling off a cliff. And then my other thing is a little fun Dragon Age thing. There's a lot of like crossovers between mentions in Dragon Age and Mass Effect, but one of them is in a major like part of the Chant of Light, which is the central text for the main religion in Dragon Age. In this song, they say the shepherd lost. Is that the text, Shelby?
I think so. I don't remember. I don't have the whole thing memorized.
But it's spelled like Alan Shepard.
Huh. Interesting. I don't know why I'm thinking, like, why wouldn't need an Alan Shepard connection to that? Like,
right.
I think it's just possible. Their own way.
Yeah.
Of referencing.
It's possible, that they decided to name their protagonist first after the astronaut Alan Shepard, and then later took advantage of the double entendre with Shepard being perhaps later fleshed out as more of a Jesus-like figure. So,
here's another perspective to jump on top of that, Sam. If you're going to write an epic fantasy or sci-fi story, I would argue that almost all of them have some sort of Christ-like figure, some of them more strongly than others. So as a versed writer who's well educated, you probably wouldn't enter into creating the Mass Effect trilogy without considering, do we have a Christ-like figure in the trilogy? And it wouldn't take very much thinking to go, well, yeah, most stories do. So yes, how do we do that? And then you start building the connective tissue. Oh, Alan Shepard is a good reference. We're making these science references, but we're also making these biblical references. We're making and drawing that across the board. Like, in my mind, in my perception of how you would go about creating something like this, the writers are educated and smart people. Like, they wouldn't stumble into a Christ-like figure. Like, if there are reasons here to connect this, they are absolutely intentional. Most, like 90% of the time. That would be my perspective on it.
And I have something to add to that is pretty definitive, but I will save it for the very end. And I think now we need to hop to the mid-break, right?
Yeah, this has been a really fun conversation. Thank you guys for joining me. And I hope you are enjoying it. We're going to get to even more stuff very soon, but we have to go thank our patrons, so don't go anywhere.
Message coming in. Patching it through.
I am sovereign, and this
Lorecast
is mine. I like the sound of that.
All right, let's try to keep this as concise as I can because this conversation's awesome and we got to get back to it. Thank you to everybody who supports us on patreon.com/Mass Effect Lorecast. We don't have any new patrons on joining us this week because it's only a few days since we're recording this ahead of time. It hasn't been a whole lot of time. But we do have to shout out our Shepard tier patrons, Ed Boy, Kira C, Lieutenant Tessino, and William. Thank you so much for your support. And anybody who would like to get your words on this show, leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts and we'll read those out on a future episode. Thank you for your support. Thank you for being here. And I hope you're enjoying the conversation. All right, let's get back to it. Here we go.
Spit it out, or are you trying to build suspense?
You're so dense, sir. Obviously, I do not know as much about human relationships as I thought.
All right, we're back. Sam, where do we go from here? I feel like we've covered a lot of ground, but I know there's more still to talk about.
Right. So here's another one that a lot of people point to when they're trying to compare Jesus with Shepard. And this one is pretty specific, right? This one is, okay, like, if we're getting into the idea that nothing in fiction is coincidental, right? Especially when there's such obvious, big influences like the Bible and so many pieces of fiction. Here it is, right? In Mass Effect 2, Shepard travels with 12 squadmates, and that includes Zaid and Kasumi, and they all expect to die or be killed in the suicide mission. Now, why is this a parallel that people might draw with Jesus?
Well, in real life, most of Jesus's disciples were killed or martyred in young age, not necessarily in old age. Sorry, the dog is coughing behind me. Only one of Jesus's disciples lives into old age, and that's John. So, I mean, them being prepared, and some of them can die, and Jesus's followers dying, I think is a huge, huge coincidence there.
And to tack onto that, they were willing to do that even before their deaths. That was part of being one of his disciples, was their willingness to stick by him at whatever end.
And that they left their lives behind,
yes,
right, to follow Jesus. Right. And these squadmates, they left their lives behind to follow Shepard.
Right. And traditionally there were 12, so 12.
There were
that
12,
number.
right? Unless, is there a differing accounts of that through
Well,
different religious texts?
Mary is very much a disciple, but she's not usually factored in that number. There were a lot of women, in fact. Some estimate that it was the majority of his followers were actually women, but it's only the 12 men who were counted in the number of 12 disciples because the patriarchy and all of that. But, there are different ways of counting this stuff. But traditionally, 12 was also important to the Hebrew people. Like Teecup mentioned, the number 7, the number 12 was also important. Numbers had meanings beyond just the specific count of the number.
Now, this is really interesting that you bring up Mary, because I was going to ask Teecup and Shecup if any of these Squadmates in Mass Effect 2 exemplified the qualities that any of the 12 disciples did, but you bring up Mary, and we also know that Liara was not really present as a Squadmate in Mass Effect 2, yet she was involved because of the Lair of the Shadow Broker. And so I wanted to posit this idea of Liara as a Mary Magdalene figure, because she does go looking for Shepard's body.
Yeah. Oh, man. We just talked about Liara a lot. We talked about how she may also be pregnant with his child due to, go back and listen to the episode. That's super crazy. There's a lot of real world speculation, these apocryphal stories about how Jesus and Mary may have had a real child, and that it connects to the Merovingian lineage in Europe and all of this wackiness. So those are apocryphal stories that may you be able to connect this to. Do you guys have other thoughts about how that might apply?
I will just get on my soapbox for a minute here, because when Sam, you messaged about this, my first initial reaction was, well, at least you're not comparing Mary Magdalene to Miranda, because Miranda is this very sexualized figure. We all know this. And a lot of times in Christian circles, Mary Magdalene is also a sexualized figure because of what, Tom, you're saying, but also because some people think that Mary Magdalene was either the woman at the well or was a sex worker from this time. There's lots of different rumors, things that people argue. I think my opinion is a lot of these kind of sexualized rumors about Mary Magdalene started in order to discredit her, because she is the first one who ever sees Jesus after he's been resurrected. And so I feel like, given the teaser trailer, I don't know what it's called, the teaser with Liara that came out a few years ago, where she's supposedly hunting for Shepard, maybe she's going to be the first one that comes upon Shepard's remains or whatever it is in the next game. I feel like that poses a huge similarity to Mary being the first one in the garden after Jesus resurrects.
Yeah, I think there's some possible connective tissue there as well. Yeah.
And Teecup, how do you feel about equivocating Liara to a Mary Magdalene figure?
I think that is probably fair, because especially a lot of biblical scholars do consider, not only is Mary Magdalene the first one to see Jesus, but she's the first one to tell anyone about it. So they consider Mary Magdalene the first preacher of the gospel. And Liara keeps the account of Shepard's story. She is the one who creates her little device that will tell Shepard's story for generations. And so I think that comparison is probably pretty nice. I do tend to stay away from I stay away from any of the theories of Mary Magdalene and Jesus having some kind of romantic relationship, because I think it brings up a lot more problems than
there's not
really
a ton of evidence for any of that, but it is fair to say that is something that has been speculated and does make its way around even in today's pop culture, right? So that it may not have any real truth value, but the fact that it is something that people conceive of and talk about means that it could influence the writing of fiction.
And if you're thinking about the Mass Effect universe, no matter who you choose to romance, right, Shepard remains close with Liara, very close. As we talked about in our Liara episodes, Tom, there are some very intimate moments, even if they're not romantic. And how abound would the speculation be after Shepard's death that, maybe Liara and Shepard were boinking? You know what I mean?
Oh, sure. Those
So-
would absolutely be rumors that would go around. In fact, there'd be rumors about Shepard and everybody in his squad, especially the people who want to cast him as the villain about all their problems post end of Mass Effect 3. Like they're going to say, well, if life would have been better and the Reapers weren't as big of a threat as we thought they were, because of course people are going to say stupid crap like that, right?
Right.
Yeah.
But there's other Squadmates too that have these seemingly biblical connections that we should examine, like Garrus, right? He's Shepard's right-hand bro, and takes on the moniker of Archangel after during Shepard's 2-year hiatus in death, and not just taking on the name of Archangel, but going into the grime of Omega and trying to exact justice the way that Shepard would have Garrus do. And so living his life basically in the image of Shepard under the name Archangel. And so you can see some of the parallels that people draw between Garrus and Michael the Archangel and the biblical connection there. But do you think it holds any weight?
I definitely think that there are a lot of comparisons between a lot of the disciples and a lot of, especially the companions from Mass Effect 2. But I like to think of Garrus as a lot like Simon Peter. Simon Peter is very much Jesus's right-hand man. Simon Peter is very impulsive, similar to Garrus. He is very much like the leader of the group, but also makes some mistakes along the way. And I feel like that also perfectly describes Garrus. Neither of them are like what you would consider like the perfect number 2, the next best guy. They both have their faults. They both are imperfect people. And I feel like they do have a lot of similarities.
And a little hot-headed or emotionally motivated, especially during that period in
absolutely.
Garrus's life. Yeah. Yeah. Sam, do you have anything else you want to ask about this one?
Well, I think that pretty much encapsulated it for Garrus, but I see also here in the notes that you guys had some particular thoughts about Jacob Taylor relating to one of the disciples.
Yes. So I think I just kind of came up with a whole list in the show notes.
Yeah, let's just dig into it. What's your list? Let's go through it. Absolutely.
I'll just go through it.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think Jacob Taylor is a lot like Matthew the tax collector, because Jacob is working with Cerberus, an enemy organization, while Matthew was a Jewish man who worked as a tax collector for the Roman Empire. This very much was like a betrayal of his people, extorting the Jewish people. So it very much is like, okay, well, you're going to betray your people. Similar vibes there. I think that Simon the Zealot is very similar to Grunt. The Zealots were a militaristic organization that fought for the oppression of the Jews to end. And so they were like a militaristic Jewish group that very much thought this is one of the places that the militaristic leader as the Messiah, they very much believed in that. So Simon the Zealot is part of this group. Similarly, the Krogan are a militaristic society fighting for the oppression of their people to end. I think we've got some similarities there. And then my last one, I didn't really feel like I had enough to argue for all of them, but the last one I have on this list is, I think we can kind of compare John, the beloved disciple and the author of the gospel, to Samara. They're both very contemplative. John brings a lot of almost mysticism and contemplation into his gospel, and Samara is the same way. I don't remember the exact order that she's part of, but she's part of this very spiritual and mystical religious organization within Mass Effect. So I feel like there are some similarities between the two of them too.
Yeah, I think those are all interesting to point out. Like I don't have anything to add to those, but I think those are pretty cool.
I only have like a very surface level understanding of scripture, if I'm being honest. But what do you think of the Vermeer survivor being somewhat like Thomas, the apostle, in that neither one of them, Cade nor Ashley, really believed it was Shepard on Horizon directly after?
I think that's Yeah, I think that's a great comparison because of the skepticism. And that's like the biggest thing. Thomas says, I won't believe that Jesus is really resurrected until I can see the places where, his hands and his feet and his side where he was nailed on the cross. Like that's what Thomas says. And Jesus appears to him and is like, hey, it was me. Here we go. Here's my hand. You can see it. Shepard kind of does the same thing. Like Shepard in Mass Effect 3 or Mass Effect 2 goes to the hospital to see them and is like, hey, let's hash all this out. Let's talk about all this. So I think there are some similarities there.
Yeah, and he has to prove himself again, too, because he's put back together by Cerberus. And so even the people who understand that he's alive again still have a lot of doubts about him. And the question is he still the same person? Which parallels that in some ways.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I also think that also parallels again back to Liara with the Mary Magdalene thing, in that she is not really surprised to see Shepard, which we now know because she helped Cerberus recover Shepard's body and knew what they were doing. So there's that. But from another perspective, Mary Magdalene is she is shocked and surprised, but she also in a lot of ways was listening and knew what was coming. And a lot of,
Now, Teecup, you had also written some notes in here about Tali.
Yes. So the Quarians overall have a lot of similarities with the Jewish people. And BioWare, again, likes to bring similarities with the Jewish people into their games, whether we're talking about the City Elves in Dragon Age or the Quarians. While the Dragon Age, they more resemble a 1930s Germany Jewish people, the Quarians very much symbolize this post-Exodus story of wandering in the wilderness. They have lost their home. They're looking to go back into their homeland. And in this thing, the Geth are the Canaanites who occupy their homeland. It's a pretty strong comparison. But I think Tali herself has a lot in common with a biblical story of the woman at the well, which is a woman who Jesus encounters in Samaria, which was a land where it was not great for Jewish people to go. And they have a talk, and she goes back and she tells everyone about what happens with her and Jesus. And I think Tali is similar to this because she goes and tries to tell the Quarians about the Reapers and about what she discovered and what she experienced with Shepard. And also in some ways, the woman of the well was kind of an outcast to society through no fault of her own. And Tali similarly faces exile, not for what she did, but for what her father did.
It's a great point. And of course, one of my favorite quotes from Tali is her passphrase that she gives to the migrant fleet when she returns, and says, after time adrift among open stars, along tides of light and through shoals of dust, I'll return to where I began, which is so, it embodies the refugee kind of element, the nomadic element of her entire people.
Yeah. So
which,
any other,
of course,
go
isn't
ahead.
limited. That element is not limited at all to Jews in the Bible, and so we should reference that. But that's all to say, comparing these squadmates in Mass Effect 2, right? We're finding these things because we're looking for them, right? We're finding the similarities because we're looking for them, but how many are that obvious?
This is tricky with any type of comparison you're doing with these kinds of things. Is when you are specifically looking for things, you're more likely to find them, but that doesn't mean that they were inserted there intentionally. So that you're right. We have to be very careful about assuming that. We can draw connections, but we can't assume intent, even though I argued for assuming intent earlier. Hey,
so
I think there's more nuanced, right? I think it's more nuanced. It's more of a there are some arguing intent for having a Christ figure. I think is pretty easy to argue for my reasons earlier. Arguing smaller connections like this, it's a little bit more tenuous. There's less evidence for it.
I wanted to compare a weak connection with some strong, obvious references, just for the comparison, so we can tell the difference of what we're talking about here. Number one, the weak connection. There's people I've read on BioWare forums that say, well, Shepard is kind of like Jesus because he helped, quote unquote, redeem a couple of his or her squad mates. And then I'd look into it, and then they'd reference Zaid, right? Or Thane, who both sought redemption for their previous acts, though Zaid didn't really know it when he was, unless you handle Zaid's loyalty mission in a Paragon way. And you can still maintain Zaid's loyalty. Thane, of course, harbors a level of guilt about his career, about what he's done in his life, and how it's affected his son. And you can be there for both of them and in a way help, quote unquote, redeem them the way that Jesus helped, redeem other people on earth. And so I feel like that's a weak connection, and a stretch in my opinion. But what do you guys think?
Can I chime in real quick before we jump to our guests? Because I think you can probably make, this is one of those weak things, because any heroic protagonist will be redeeming the people around them, regardless if they're a Christ figure or not. That's just the nature of a hero. So to your point, I think that is kind of a tenuous connection. You would expect that the hero would help people with their own redemption arcs. Period.
Yeah.
That's my thought.
I think with all of this, I agree that this is a weak connection. And to Tom's point, we actually have in biblical studies, we have a word for assuming when you look for something and you find it. And it's called eisegesis, and it's the opposite of exegesis. Exegesis means to draw out. Same root as educate. And so you draw out.
And not spelled with a J like the name Jesus, yes. Jesus, Genesis.
And also
exogesis, like
Jesus
and also
an exosuit.
Right.
Yeah. So I also want to just take a moment of personal hilarious, and that Genesis from the Two Girls One Ship podcast will appreciate this. The verb of exegesis is to exegete. Right. So take that as you will.
Yeah. Exegetical. There's all sorts of fun words that go with these. But yeah, absolutely. This is something that Christians do all too often, and probably every single Christian ever has tried to eisegete something into the text that isn't actually there, rather than taking the text at face value and what comes out of it. It's just human nature to want to see what we want to see in things. So it is, you're right. In biblical studies, it's something that everyone's being trained very, very strongly in trying to not do, is to eisegete the text. So, yeah, absolutely. Any other thoughts? Shelby, I don't know if Shelby had any other thoughts on this. You were nodding along.
No, I was just going to say ditto to everything you said, but I also think this whole, we see what we want to see is intrinsic to human nature, not just, conversations about biblical anything or Christianity. Like everyone does this, like every religion does this. And in fact, we are doing this ourselves looking at Mass Effect. So, it's we all do it.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Very meta, but that's kind of the point of the whole episode. So there's a much stronger connection if you're going to draw parallels between biblical references and Mass Effect, right? For example, Legion. Legion itself is given the name Legion by EDI, who quotes scripture.
Yeah.
EDI quotes scripture verbatim in the game. So that's you can't get more on the nose than that. But I also found it interesting that on the note of Legion, Sovereign is referred to by the Geth as Nazara. I mean, it's very close to Nazareth, right? And beyond the point of probable coincidence. And of course, then there's Garrus taking on the moniker of Archangel.
Yeah, it's probably a hodgepodge mix of some of these were absolutely intentional, and some of them were just it's connective enough. Maybe it's a coincidence, but
right.
Yeah.
And I could have sworn, and correct me if I'm wrong, any one of you, but I could have sworn that I remembered at some point in Mass Effect 2, when Harbinger is assuming direct control and doing those voices, that Harbinger actually refers to them, as in the Reapers, as "We are Legion."
I believe so.
Is
yes.
that? I think I remember hearing that. I can't remember if it's Harbinger or Sovereign, but I could have sworn that they refer to themselves, the Reapers, as Legion, strongly referencing that they are demons.
Yeah. I think that's pretty firm in there. Teacup?
I think Legion is one of these, like you said, these really strong comparisons for a lot of reasons. Because if we take the story of I Am Legion for We Are Many, it's basically there's this man, he's possessed by a numerous number of demons. Jesus casts them out, puts them into pigs, and then the pigs run off the cliff.
Poor pigs.
That's the story.
That story sucks for the pigs.
I just feel bad for the pig farmer who probably lost.
Yeah, right? The pigs and the pig farmer
entire livelihood.
really got the crappy end of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But so there's this thing about it with Legion in that, like, there's this story of in the Legion of someone being, cleansed of that which is controlling them to be free to make choices for themselves, which is Legion's entire story, is that he breaks free of the Reaper Code and is free to choose his own future and history with all things. I also think Legion has a lot of comparisons with Paul, one of the main writers of the New Testament, in that Paul starts as Saul, as a person who is persecuting Christians and killing Christians and an enemy of Christians, and then later in his life changes sides and becomes one of like the biggest proponents of the movement and one of the reasons that it has any success getting out in the world.
Yeah, if it wasn't for Paul's writings and his work in the diaspora, that's another fun word, the Romans wouldn't have ever taken on Christianity, and the rest of the world wouldn't have ever known that it existed, really. Those are some interesting connections, for sure.
So I wanted to move on to another point here. It's our penultimate point, that Shepard tries to warn those in power, and in doing so is often spurned. They're not believed. They're ridiculed by everyone in power that they try to warn about the impending threat of the Reapers. And so the people who try and push this theory of Shepard being space Jesus, they will point to this and they'll say, Jesus tried to warn humanity, basically, of what was to come, to turn away from false idols and false gods. And in Jesus's preachings too, through all of his preachings, he was persecuted. Now, I think that this is kind of a iffy connection because Shepard really wasn't persecuted by the council. If anything, Shepard was uplifted by the council, just not totally believed.
Yeah, I agree. I think that this is another one of those things that falls into every story, every plot of every story ever. If you're going to build toward a climax, you have to set up the hero to not be believed, to be doubted, to be fought against in so many different ways. So try finding a story where the hero isn't doubted at some point. You're going to have a hard time finding that.
Is it fair?
Yeah,
is it similar to compare the council to the Romans, biblically speaking?
They are the controlling power.
I would argue that no. Because I think the council falls more in line with what's called the Sanhedrin, which is a council of Jewish religious leaders, both Pharisees and Sadducees, who basically control doctrine and Jewish life throughout the entire world and release edicts. And basically, Jesus has huge rebukes of these people and comes to blows with them. But I think that the main thing is that the Sanhedrin are an internal critique.
Right.
Jesus does critique Rome, but he doesn't really go head to head with Rome that often until you get to he's at conversations with Pilate or, some with Quintus or whatever is going on in there. He is mainly going blows to blows with members of the Sanhedrin.
Right. I think this is great. I think this is a really strong point because Shepard is a member of that group. The Romans in the world of the Hebrews are an external force that came and took over, and then now they have to pay taxes and follow their laws. So yeah, you're right. That does match up better than saying that they are Romans. Absolutely. And most of the time, Jesus' critiques were for his own people. They weren't about the Romans. Pay Caesar what's Caesar's, that kind of thing. Absolutely.
Shecup, you were going to bring up a point in regards to, comparing Shepard with Jesus in as much as those in power would not listen to warnings.
Yeah, and I do think there is some similarity here that Shepard is not listened to and Jesus is not listened to, but also they kind of also are. They're not listened to by those in power, but they are listened to by the everyday people. That's something they share as well. But I also think this, as going back to Tom's point, this is something that's almost intrinsic to every hero's journey story that's ever been told. And furthermore, this story of someone saying, hey, this bad thing's going to happen if you keep doing this, is scattered all over the Bible. Like every prophet ever is not listened to, because that's the whole point of a prophet. So I feel like
it's so sad. Your job is to tell people the truth, and no one will ever listen to you. Good luck.
One prophet in the entire Bible succeeds. One.
Jonah,
and then he throws a hissy fit because he didn't want to succeed.
Yeah, and there's some, and this is a total side tangent, there's some speculation that Jonah is one of the ones that didn't actually exist and was written as a warning story and as a, what's the word? When you make fun of something, a satire.
Satire.
Was originally written as satire and wasn't actually a real person. But yeah, who knows?
But I mean, this also goes back to Greek mythology with Cassandra, right? She was fated to never be believed, yet she could always see what was to come. And so, yeah, I don't know. I think it's kind of a weak comparison to Shepard, though I think it is fair to say that Shepard does become a prophet after Shepard receives the vision from the Prothean beacon.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. He has a connection to truth and reality in a way that other people don't. And whether those people believe him or not is up to them.
And also from a point of like Shepard has one of parts of Jesus is like his connection to what has come before. And Shepard, through these visions, has that connection so much to the point by the end, he actually has a Prothean on his side to come and fight the Reapers.
Yeah, interesting. That's cool. All right.
So going one step further, because this is something that I just saw in like a couple of comments on forums about this exact topic, comparing Shepard to face Jesus. Can the Reaper invasion be aptly compared to the Rapture? And now this is something that I know that both of you had put a note in these notes about, that the Rapture itself isn't even biblical.
Well, a lot of people will. Not. Yeah, it depends. So there are lots of different Christians in this world, and there are lots of different perspectives on. And so if you go to certain very conservative evangelical beliefs, they jump through all these different hoops, and I'm sure some of our readers are going to be upset that I'm even saying this, but they jump through a lot of hoops in order to justify a very, very, very literal interpretation of the scripture and how all the scripture connects in all of these really crazy ways, which justifies the rapture and all of those other kinds of things. There is a significant portion of our population, especially here in the United States, who does believe that that's true. A lot of theologians do not believe that the rapture is a literal thing, and that our interpretation of the book of Revelation and the other things that point towards rapture are more figurative in explanation.
I think to come in here, like, yes, the rapture is not biblical. The word rapture is never used in the Bible.
Right.
The big theological word that we use is called an eschaton, which, again, you've got $4 million worth of words from this episode.
I'm learning a lot. I feel good about it, but
yeah.
And so eschatology, which is the study of a lot of things, is really centered on what is the centralized hope of this story, the centralized redeeming factor, what will the world become? What is the hope that the world leans to? The Bible definitely talks about that.
Right.
But this idea of what you talk, some of us, I think we're old enough to all be traumatized by the Left Behind series.
Yeah. Even here's some other fun words. Apocalyptic eschatology is a style of writing that shows up in the second half of the book of Daniel in the Old Testament and the book of Revelation and numerous other documents that have been found. So the way that the way that those stories are written, we talked about how numbers have meanings outside of just the count of the numbers. Those kinds of that kind of symbology, a lot of the words, a lot of that stuff that goes into writing those is actually a style of writing a story. And you can see it across lots of different things outside of the Bible too. So Yeah. So the whole rapture thing, and let's go back to your point though, of like, is that representative of the rapture? Even if they were trying to make that connection, it's not a good thing for people who believe in something, which is what people would argue the rapture is. It's actually a very bad thing that should be avoided.
The Reaper invasion.
The Reaper invasion. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. The biblical rapture, as some people believe it as a thing that is good, and it's the natural end of the world, or this age, depending on your belief structure.
And yet the Reapers would have you believe that this is the means through which you can ascend.
Yeah, but how many people in Mass Effect really believe that? I'm not sure that.
I don't know.
Yeah,
maybe cultists,
but it's not. Right. It's not a predominant belief. I think you would have to argue that it like, had they indoctrinated a larger percentage of the population and the people were actively working to make that happen, I feel like you can make a better rapture argument.
I think that the Reapers, in a lot of ways, if you want to make this comparison and you really want to dig deep, there are three things that you can compare this to in reference to the Bible and the world in which Jesus walks into. And the first one is called the Babylonian exile, which the kingdom of Babylon rises up, destroys Jerusalem, destroys Judea, scatters all the people. It's a big deal. And then you also have Alexander the Great's conquest and the Hellenization, or the Greekification of the world. And then you also have Rome itself coming in and doing that. All these points in these greatly redefine how the Jewish people view their faith, how they view their worship, how they view their part in the world, what they do to survive. It greatly alters their entire culture. And so in a lot of ways, the Reapers represent this cataclysm, or this, catastrophe that resets and changes that, similar to these points in Jewish history that Jesus and his disciples would be all too familiar with.
That's an interesting connection. I like that.
But we couldn't, even assuming that you are a Christian who believes in the rapture, you can't even compare the Reapers to the rapture because of A, like what Tom said, it wouldn't be a good thing. It's not something you're looking forward to. And B, given what I know about fundamentalist belief in the rapture, the Reapers are not making any distinction between believers and non-believers. They are harvesting everybody.
Yes, they harvest everyone. Yes.
The only argument you can make for a sort of rapture or end of times comparison is that the Reapers say that they are preserving life by their harvest. So you could make an eternal life argument if you really wanted to stretch.
Yeah, that's pretty stretched. It's like justifying Thanos and destroying half the galaxy in order to save half the galaxy. You're still murdering half the freaking galaxy. Yeah.
Full motive, still murder.
Right.
So let's move on to the final point that I want to bring up here. And this is something that came up in my mind when I was trying to both prove and disprove this theory of Shepard being written to be this space Jesus. So some people might be familiar with the story of the devil tempting Jesus, right, in the desert. I think it happens a couple of other times in the Bible. But then when you think about it in Mass Effect, you have these false prophets, so to speak, Saren and the Elusive Man. And each one of them have a conversation with Shepard directly at the end of Mass Effect 1 and at the end of Mass Effect 3. And in my opinion, I'm looking at that, and in both conversations, both people, Saren and the Elusive Man, are making this last-ditch effort to try and tempt Shepard into coalescing, into submitting to the Reapers, or submitting rather to the Elusive Man's hubris of thinking he can control the Reapers. Both are making these last-ditch efforts, and both, to me, appear similar to the devil, the stereotypical devil on your shoulder, right? Trying to tempt Shepard at the last moment. But what do you make of it in terms of comparing both of them to the devil's, temptation of Jesus?
I think the temptation is definitely in there. That's an apt comparison. Especially because when you think about the temptations of Jesus, the things Jesus is tempted with are exert your power and control the world. That's really what he's tempted with. Because what else could God be tempted with other than complete and utter dominion and oppression and control. And so, yes, like that. And that's what they're trying to tempt Shepard with. Though I do think that the Elusive Man and Saren, in a lot of ways, don't really play a devil role, perhaps, in the story, and more play a Judas role. Just because, especially Saren, in a lot of ways, and the Elusive Man, but Saren is supposed to be, he's the best Spectre. He is the one who is supposed to be, you know, the one that leads or does everything for the council,
Right.
but he
betrayed
falls
the council.
and he betrays the council. Judas was the most qualified to be Jesus's disciple. He was the one who knew the most, who tried to get everything right, who listened at every word that Jesus said. And the Elusive Man, too, is supposed to be this. He had the potential to be this great force that really advocated for the, you know, equitable treatment of humanity in space, but he then goes too far, and that's what Judas does. Like, he takes it too far, but Judas, the entire time he's doing it up until the end of his life, thinks that he is making the right decision.
That is very similar to the end conversation we have with both Saren and the Elusive Man, where if you choose the consistently Paragon or Renegade speech checks and you make every single one, they finally snap out of it. Both of them do. But it's too late by that point. And I think maybe what we're seeing is a similarity in corruption. Both of them, Saren and the Elusive Man, were similarly corrupted. So I think it's really interesting here because the Reapers are behind both of it, right? Both the Elusive Man and Saren being corrupted. And Sovereign itself exalts the Reapers as being inevitable, right? That they're you know, the Reapers, we later learn, were created out of the Leviathan's hubris. And the Catalyst, you could argue, falls from grace with the Leviathans when it decides that its imperative is greater than that of its creator's existence. And it, or the Reapers, you know, both of them, I guess you could say, since the Catalyst controls the Reapers, they describe themselves as something above a god or gods. So would that make them similar to Satan in as much as exalting themselves above God, you know, referring to themselves as inevitable, and basically being power hungry in that regard?
What do you guys think?
So we've brought up this word, the devil, Satan, Antichrist. These are all different things when we talk about the biblical text. And so I want to talk about Satan for a little bit, or in Hebrew, it's Satan. It's a title. It means the adversary or a prosecutor. It's a legal term.
Right. It shows up in the book of Job, right? And he's the prosecuting attorney of the angels.
Yeah, the one who stands in the way. There's a story in the Bible, it's more obscure, but this like wizard, yes, for lack of a better word, wizard is hired to curse the Israelites, and an angel stands in the way, and then there's a talking donkey. It's crazy. Just look it up.
Yeah.
But the angel is called a Satan, the adversary. The angel stands in the way. And this idea of like a personified devil doesn't show up until the book of Job, which is written in like the 500s BCE. So that's a long time when we're talking about the longevity of Jewish writings where this figure doesn't show up. Now, this like tempter shows up from the very beginning, like from the Garden of Eden with the serpent. Like there's all kinds of temptation out there, but this idea of the devil is something that is relatively new by the time that the Gospels are being written.
Yeah, there's even some evidence that it was inserted into their belief system through connections with like Zoroastrians and some of these other faiths, which had this like positive, negative God thing going on. That's one of those things that people bring up as like, well, maybe this is why the Jews believe this, and that sort of connection.
Now, as a non-theologian who's having trouble keeping it, I'm going to play advocate for the listener and say, are you making a distinction here between, quote unquote, the devil and Lucifer?
Yes, there is a distinct connection because Lucifer never appears in the Bible. And instead, Lucifer comes from Dante's Divine Comedy. And so that's much, much later than the Bible. This idea of So like the Satan in some Hebrew texts, God is referred to as the Satan of evil, the adversary of evil is like where that comes in. And part of this is a problem that we're dealing with a text that was written in Hebrew, translated to Greek, translated from Hebrew to Latin, translated from Latin to English, and then so
right.
we got a lot going on here. And so my argument here would be is that the Satan and the devil, there's not really a connection between the two until you get to one of the later gospels, which is the Gospel of John. And sometimes you get translations that say, because John will say the devil had already entered Judas to do this, or he'll say Satan had already done this, but that's a later. But they're using the phrase devil. And then Satan is in the book of Job, and it's unclear what those are coming into. And then Antichrist is really mentioned only in the letters of John, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. So there's the Gospel of John, and then there's the letters of John.
Yeah, this is New Testament stuff. So this is way later than those other documents that he's talking about. Yeah.
And then the Antichrist also appears in the book of Revelation. And there's weird kind of comparison that's going on here, like the association of 666. We talked about numbers having significance in there. Every number in Hebrew has a corresponding letter, or each letter has a corresponding number. And so like 666 spells out the name Nero Caesar, who was at the time of Revelation the person who was, burning Rome and blaming the Christians for it and doing all of these things that oppressed them. So like you have the Antichrist there. So I think that the elusive man does serve as like this idea of the adversary. I think they fit the Satan in that way, but I don't think they necessarily fit the archetype of like this like personified version of evil that we think of modern day in the devil.
Yeah. It's like Satan and the devil kind of merged together over time, and then Lucifer got added in onto that. But Antichrist, the persona of an Antichrist, at least in my understanding of John's letters, was anyone who stood against Jesus is an Antichrist. That's the general meaning of that. And then over time, that became a specific figure that will show up at a certain time of history that will usher in the end of the age and all of that kind of stuff, which is more of a Book of Revelations sort of thing that people have blown up into other stuff. But I think what is important for our conversation about Mass Effect is you could boil devil, Satan down to people's perception of a evil figure that is in direct contention with God. And then you could boil down Antichrist into somebody who is there to lead the Christ figure astray or to fight against the Christ figure as an adversary in the world somewhere. You could probably, like that's generally, in my perception, the popular understanding of those things, whether those things are biblically supported or not. Does that help, Sam?
Yes. So my entire understanding of religion is being completely shaken right now. But anyway, no, I was going to ask if we believe that the elusive man exemplifies Antichrist-like tendencies, because he, and assuming that Antichrist means Christ-like, but the antithesis of Christ's intentions, that he is very charismatic, right? He has the means to help people and perform what some would deem to be miracles, and yet he's actually being controlled by the Reapers, evil. Right. And makes these repeated attempted temptations towards Shepard, who in this allegory we would be comparing to Jesus.
Yeah. So typically when people say Antichrist, they typically are meaning somebody who comes to power, a powerful individual who is pushing a mandate that is against what Jesus would want. And in those simple terms, you could say, yeah, sure, the elusive man he's an anti-Shepard. He is a powerful figure who has a lot of authority. He has a lot of power in the universe. He has military at his fingers, and he's actively eventually working directly against what Shepard is looking to accomplish for whatever means you could justify in whatever way. But you could also draw the connection to the fact that he has been compromised by the Reapers, who are associated directly with a devil or Satan or something that's just evil, big bad guy. And so you could draw that connection between the two if you wanted to. Now, whether that's there intentionally or not, that's a harder question to answer. Does that help kind of boil it down a little bit into at least the way I would imagine most people would perceive that argument, or at least those words?
Sure. So why don't we wrap up and just kind of prescribe this a judgment to this theory about Shepard being a space Jesus figure? Because we've gone through several points now. There's others that people will bring up. I'm sure we'll see some of them in the comments on this. But as the three of you are well educated in theology, what do you give this theory, ranking from F, fail, to like completely
S tier, S plus tier,
to A plus, being like, yep, it fits spot on.
We're not using video game ranking.
I wasn't going to. I was going to go with A plus through F. But
right.
How would you guys consider it?
Yeah, let's start with one of you guys. Who wants to go first?
Yeah, so I feel like there is a real meaningful difference between Shepard being a Christ figure and Shepard being space Jesus. And so for me, I'm giving this theory a B-ish, somewhere in the realm of a B, because I do think that the literary comparison of Shepard as a Christ figure is spot on. Like I feel like you can't even really deny that Shepard is a messianic figure. Shepard sacrifices themselves for the galaxy, is resurrected, slam dunk, right? But whether or not Shepard is space Jesus, I feel like is a different question. Because I feel like when you're saying Shepard is space Jesus, you have to feel a lot more of the same exact things that Jesus did. And I feel like that's when it starts to that's when the metaphor starts to fall apart for me. So I land in the realm of yes, part of this, absolutely. Other parts of it, maybe not.
So Shepard is space Jesus inspired?
Sure, we can go with that.
Okay, cool. Teecup, what do you think?
How do you feel?
Yeah.
I think that Shepard definitely does fill this messianic role, like Shelby said. I think I'd give it probably B-. The comparison with Jesus of Nazareth is there's some coincidences, but this is probably just to further the messianic. But I think one of the strongest points for the messianic is that Shepard is the only one to undo thousands upon tens of thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years, maybe millions of years of this ever-ending cycle of death. And Shepard is the one that comes in, that the catalyst says, you're the anomaly. You have changed the rules. You have changed the way that this is going to operate. And that is the role that this messianic figure fills in that. So I would give that, like Shelby said, there is no doubt that Shepard is a messianic figure. Is he space Jesus, though? Nah.
But to that point, what you just said was that the catalyst tells Shepard has changed the rules. And that's something that I've heard a lot of different Christians in different sects describe Jesus as, that Jesus's life changed the rules.
Right. It's the messianic
of our
thing.
Spirituality.
It's the messianic thing. They're spot on. I'll chime in too. We go ahead. Go ahead.
Can I just respond to what Sam was saying?
Sure.
I would push back on that, because in the Bible, Jesus also says, I don't come to abolish the law and the prophets. I've come to fulfill them. So to me, it's not really as much as it is abolishing or changing the rules as it is interpreting them a little bit differently.
What if what he's abolishing is death through the Reapers? And so therefore it's not so much that Shepard is abolishing the rules. It's that Shepard is redefining sin and death. And so that's the connective thing.
Right. I think that's a good point. And like to another point to like the idea that Jesus changes the rules. One of Jesus's most famous things is what's referred to as the greatest commandment, which is to love God and to love your neighbor. These are direct Old Testament references. Jesus isn't like skirting the question. He's answering the question directly. He's basically saying to the religious leaders, you know what the greatest ones are because you've been told.
Right.
And these are what they are.
Right. You like stop misinterpreting the things that you've already been told. This is the stuff that really matters. Yeah. So,
right, so Tom,
I'll
what do you give it?
Yeah, I'm in agreement with him. I think we're all in agreement about the same thing. I think the biggest distinction here is that when both Teecup and Shecup are saying that he's space Messiah, yes, he's not space Jesus. I think that this is just I think colloquially, however you say that word, the average person who hasn't gone to school for these things like we have will just make no distinction between those two things. When they are saying he's space Jesus, what they're actually saying is he is a messianic figure in the Mass Effect universe. They're not actually trying to say that he is Jesus, because that's very, very specific, and it also would be weird in the story if he had all of those parallels, because the story would be very different at that point. It would be a retelling of scripture in a new wrapper that looks like space and aliens. And that's not what we're getting. We're getting a story about space and aliens with a messianic figure.
Right. And I think it stands out. First of all, I think people just say, oh, Shepard, space Jesus, because it's, first of all, catchy, colloquial way to say that. Right. And second of all, it's a metaphor, saying that, someone is blah, blah, blah. It's a metaphor, not a simile. And the other thing is, you compare it. We have a Mass Effect game that came out after the trilogy, right? It's Andromeda. There is no messianic figure in Andromeda. I would not trust the writers to save me from shit.
Well, they're still in middle school.
They have an objective and they accomplish that objective. But I would definitely not ever describe their writers as messianic.
No.
Yeah. Well said.
Before I want to share my favorite comment from one of the Reddit posts that Sam shared with us, which is that I don't know what Bible y'all been reading, but I didn't think it included a Messiah that is a assault rifle wielding lesbian. That's great.
Love it.
That's great.
Nice. Oh, I promised you guys that I was going to have something definitive by the end of this. So I just asked one of the Mass Effect trilogy developers that I know, and I just DM'd him. And I said, we're doing an episode examining the fan theory that Shepard is a space Jesus type figure. Was this a known comparison amongst the development teams, or is it just narrative happenstance? And his response immediately is 100% known and joked about, but not a huge focus. So, put more succinctly, he says, it's definitely intentional symbolism, but it's also not that important, and it's really just something that people can ignore if they want, But there's certainly some references that are intentionally thrown in there, and then, it's he says, he's joking partially here, but he says it's never something we leaned into super hard, but our writers weren't idiots. So
great.
The writers are smart. As you said, Tom, the writers are smart. They know what they're doing.
They know what they're doing. They know what this is going to be compared to. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah. And I actually thought of this while we were doing the episode. The Citadel DLC somewhat serves as a Last Supper kind of opportunity for Shepard as a Jesus type figure, because if played the way that it appears that you must play it, you play it right before the end mission where Shepard sacrifices themselves.
Yeah,
and
holy
it is
crap.
a last party, a last hurrah with your followers.
Right. But again, yes, that's very biblical if you want to couch that in the idea of a Last Supper. But it's also very just literary. Hey, the hero and his squad is about to go into the climax of the story, so they're going to have this last hurrah before they go off and maybe don't make it. Which one is it? Maybe it's both.
Yeah, of course. And there was no wine. There was no
right.
there was no Judas there at that Last Supper. So, right. So, there's a lot of holes in there.
There was alcohol, though.
There was alcohol. Yes.
And dancing.
Yeah,
I don't think there's dancing in the Bible version. Is there dancing? They don't mention it. I'm not saying it's impossible, but I don't think it was specifically mentioned.
I don't think that there was an Evolus pizza delivery guy in the Bible either.
No.
There was no Jesus clone either, was there?
Yeah, that would have been a very different biblical story if there was. That would
The
change.
Bible too. Bible order.
Actually, here's a fun fact for you. The name Jesus is actually pretty common.
Oh yeah,
It's basically the equivalent of Josh.
Yeah, it's Joshua, Yeshua, or however they pronounced it back then. Yeah.
Today I learned.
Yeah.
Jesus is Josh.
I also wanted to bring up Thane's prayer that he has Koliot actually read while Thane is dying on his deathbed. And so if you look that up, while I'm talking right now, you'll see that when you read it, to me at least, as someone from the outside in, not, theologically trained or educated at all, the way that it reads, and this is probably just a testament to the writer's talent, is the way that it reads to me like scripture. In part of it, Thane's prayer describing Shepard as, quote, or as having a, quote, heart that is pure but beset by wickedness and contention. And it reads like scripture to me, but also almost elevates Shepard to a messianic level with that Thane is praying for Shepard's soul and to not give in to the temptation.
I mean, it comes across to me like it has a lot of repetition in it. It comes across like something that you would read monks would have written centuries ago, because there's a repetition, there's a pattern, there's a rhythm to it. Oftentimes they would use prayer like this for meditation. And so you would say the thing over and over and over again. And a lot of times those prayers were specifically about yourself. They were about like, free me from the evil thoughts that I've been having, set me on the right path, like those kinds of things. So it does kind of have that shape to it. But the fact
that's
that it's
the interesting thing, that prayer Shepard thought he was saying about himself until the very final line where he says he, and then it's revealed that Thane was actually having the prayer said for Shepard.
Yeah, I would guess that is the inspiration for something like this, is the history of those kinds of prayers and the way that those are used. But I mean, that's just right off the top of my head. So,
you know what I think? It just occurred to me what it reminds me of: the Lord's Prayer. It reminds me of the Lord's Prayer. And, for those who don't know, for those who aren't Catholic or ever went to a Lutheran, traditional ceremony, you'd probably recognize it, by its cadence, by its rhythm,
it's part of the liturgy. It's part of the experience, the communal experience, as well as the solo experience. So yeah,
right.
I think there are definitely some similarities there. Sure.
It's the one that starts, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. It's that one. And so, yeah, I think, at least in terms of cadence and the overall feeling for Thane's prayer, that kind of reminds me of that one. But now, hold on. Before we wrap up, I need to hear Teecup's comparison of Morden to Moses, because I don't see any similarities right now.
So, Moses, this is a dig, but just one that I thought of. But so Moses, in a lot of the ways that the story is told, is raised from like the view of his oppressors, of the Hebrew people. And so like Morden in this way is that, in a way, he is from the Solarian people. He developed the genophage. He's partly responsible for he is responsible for the genophage. And then Moses kills a man and he runs off into the wilderness, into Midian, where he meets Jethro and his, really good looking wife, Zipporah. And he changes and comes to his own life. He becomes content, sort of like Morden does when he is on Omega and he is trying to cure this disease in his clinic. Morden is content to just live his life until Moses sees the burning bush. Morden encounters Shepard to come and stop the collectors. And that is eventually what leads Moses to go and free the Israelite people and undo the system that he had taken part in, similar to Morden, who then goes and, depending on your choices, but if you choose what I believe is the correct choice, Morden then sacrifices himself to cure the genophage. And similar, Moses never enters the promised land because he hit a rock in anger and God said, nope, you don't get to come. And then Morden likewise does not get to see the fruit of his labor.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. I hadn't considered that. All right. Any other thoughts on any of these? You got any thoughts on this, Sam?
Would have liked to study the seashells in the parted sea. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. You know what I want to hear is some of the people listening to this episode and your thoughts on these things, because I'm sure we have opened up a whole bunch of different cans of worms. And please remember that all of this comes from a point of care. None of us are trying to offend anybody. We're just reporting the things that we've learned and shared and all of that. So please kindly respond, either comment on this episode, jump in the Discord, or those kinds of things. Because if you might have perspectives on these things that we haven't considered and might completely change our thoughts on this, because that's what these conversations are about. So please chime in, let us know. Sam, are we good? Or is this it? Anything else?
That's it. I don't have any personal opinion one way or the other about, is Shepard space Jesus? Now that I've learned the truth, you know what I mean, from the development team, that they, definitely intentional, but it's not canon that Shepard is Jesus. It's just not a huge focus. They just threw some similarities in there, and there are some influences, of course, as there is with any writing. So that's just kind of what I have to take away from it. But I think it's fun to kind of dissect these theories, and I hope it's been fun for our listeners in this episode, looking at these major points and then weighing them and seeing if there's evidence, yes or no.
Absolutely. Awesome. Well, this has been such a fun conversation. Hope you guys have enjoyed this extra long episode. And thanks especially to Teecup and Shecup for taking the time to join us and hang out and talk about these really interesting things. I know I've learned some things. I hope everybody else has. And how can people check out the stuff that you're doing? What are you doing? Share it again. Who wants to go? Who wants to start us off?
I'll share.
Yeah.
So y'all can find us at the Dragon Age Lorecast or the Assassin's Creed Lorecast, wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also find us at our website, cupspodcasting.com. We have Discord server. All of our links are on the website, so check us out there, or listen to us on any of your favorite podcatchers, or you can catch Austin on the Holocron Histories podcast without me, unfortunately, but with Ben of Temeria. So check him out over there for Star Wars.
Awesome Star Wars stuff. Teacup, anything else you want to say before we head out?
Just that if you want more religious analysis content, if this was totally your jam, go check out our episodes on the Elven gods from Dragon Age, because we do a lot of deep dive comparisons to other pantheons and things in there.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, go check out their stuff. Thank you for joining us again. And Sam, I know you've got stuff to share.
Yeah, I'm streaming every weekend my headcanon playthrough of Mass Effect 3, and we're about halfway through that right now. We just got to the point where we'll go to the Ardat Yakshi Monastery, and so that'll be pretty fun. It is a heavily modded playthrough. I've been enjoying that. I will be taking a brief hiatus off of streaming as I move to yet another place. I know, a lot of moves that I've taken during the production of this podcast, but I will be moving, and my fiance and I will have a lot more space. We'll be sedentary in that spot for at least a little while. I'm looking forward to that. But yeah, in the meantime, everyone can catch up with me in the updates on Twitch and Twitter at N7TheLegend.
Awesome. And of course, you can check out my stuff. I do a bunch of other Lorecasts. But then there are also a bunch of other shows on the network, like the ones that you've heard mentioned today. You can go to robotsradio.net, check out my shows and everybody else on the network. I know you're going to find other stuff that you would love over there. And thanks for tuning in again. We'll be back next week. And until then, stay safe out there, and definitely let us know about your thoughts about Space Jesus and how all that stuff works. All right, we'll see you next time. Bye, everybody. Thanks for tuning into the Mass Effect Lorecast. We'd love to hear your opinion and thoughts on the lore of Mass Effect. Reach out to us on Twitter at Mass Effect Cast, or check out the Robots Radio Discord Also, you can send us an email at masseffectlorecast@gmail.com.